Raffles and Miss Blandish. Nearly half a century after his first appearance, Raffles, the amateur cracksman, is still one of the best-known characters in English fiction. Very few people would need telling that he played cricket for England, had bachelor chambers in the Albany, and burgled the Mayfair houses, which he also entered as a guest. Just for that reason, he and his exploits make a suitable background against which to examine a more modern crime story, such as No Orchids for Miss Blandish. Any such choice is necessarily arbitrary. I might equally well have chosen Arsène Lupin, for instance, but at any rate, No Orchids and the Raffles books have the common quality of being crime stories which play the limelight on the criminal rather than the policeman. For sociological purposes, they can be compared. No Orchids is the 1939 version of glamorized crime, Raffles the 1900 version. What I am concerned with here is the immense difference in moral atmosphere between the two books, and the change in the popular attitude that this probably implies. At this date, the charm of Raffles is partly in the period atmosphere, and partly in the technical excellence of the stories. Hornung was a very conscientious and, on his level, a very able writer. Anyone who cares for sheer efficiency must admire his work. However, the truly dramatic thing about Raffles, the thing that makes him a sort of byword even to this day. Only a few weeks ago, in a burglary case, a magistrate referred to the prisoner as a Raffles in real life, is the fact that he is a gentleman. Raffles is presented to us, and this is rubbed home in countless scraps of dialogue and casual remarks, not as an honest man who has gone astray, but as a public school man who has gone astray. His remorse, when he feels any, is almost purely social. He has disgraced the old school. He has lost his right to enter decent society. He has forfeited his amateur status and become a cad. Neither Raffles nor Bunny appears to feel at all strongly that stealing is wrong in itself, though Raffles does once justify himself by the casual remark that the distribution of property is all wrong anyway. They think of themselves not as sinners, but as renegades, or simply as outcasts. And the moral code of most of us is still so close to Raffles's own that we do feel his situation to be an especially ironical one. A West End clubman who is really a burglar. That is almost a story in itself, is it not? But how if it were a plumber or a greengrocer who was really a burglar? Would there be anything inherently dramatic in that? No, although the theme of the double life, of respectability covering crime, is still there. Even Charles Peace in his clergyman's dog collar seems somewhat less of a hypocrite than Raffles in his Zingari blazer. Raffles, of course, is good at all games, but it is peculiarly fitting that his chosen game should be cricket. This allows not only of endless analogies between his cunning as a slow bowler and his cunning as a burglar, but also helps to define the exact nature of his crime. Cricket is not, in reality, a very popular game in England. It is nowhere near so popular as football, for instance, but it gives expression to a well-marked trait in the English character, the tendency to value form, or style, more highly than success. In the eyes of any true cricket lover, it is possible for an innings of 10 runs to be better, i.e., more elegant, than an innings of 100 runs. Cricket is also one of the very few games in which the amateur can excel the professional. It is a game full of forlorn hopes and sudden dramatic changes of fortune, and its rules are so ill-defined that their interpretation is partly an ethical business. When Larwood, for instance, practiced bodyline bowling in Australia, he was not actually breaking any rule. He was merely doing something that was not cricket. Since cricket takes up a lot of time and is rather expensive to play, it is predominantly an upper-class game, but for the whole nation, it is bound up with such concepts as good form, playing the game, etc., and it has declined in popularity just as the tradition of "don't hit a man when he's down" has declined. It is not a 20th century game, and nearly all modern-minded people dislike it. The Nazis, for instance, were at pains to discourage cricket, which had gained a certain footing in Germany before and after the last war. In making Raffles a cricketer as well as a burglar, Hornung was not merely providing him with a plausible disguise. He was also drawing the sharpest moral contrast that he was able to imagine. Raffles, no less than Great Expectations or Les Rouges et les Noirs, is a story of snobbery, and it gains a great deal from the precariousness of Raffles's social position. A cruder writer would have made the gentleman burglar a member of the peerage, or at least a baronet. Raffles, however, is of upper middle-class origin and is only accepted by the aristocracy because of his personal charm. "We were in society but not of it," he says to Bunny towards the end of the book, "and I was asked about for my cricket." Both he and Bunny accept the values of society unquestioningly, and would settle down in it for good if only they could get away with a big enough haul. The ruin that constantly threatens them is all the blacker because they only doubtfully belong. A duke who has served a prison sentence is still a duke, whereas a mere man about town, if once disgraced, ceases to be about town forevermore. The closing chapters of the book, where Raffles has been exposed and is living under an assumed name, have a Twilight of the Gods feeling, a mental atmosphere rather similar to that of Kipling's poem Gentleman Rankers. A trooper of the forces, I who kept my own 6 horses, etc. Raffles now belongs irrevocably to the cohorts of the damned. He can still commit successful burglaries, but there is no way back into paradise, which means Piccadilly and the MCC. According to the public school code, there is only one means of rehabilitation: death in battle. Raffles dies fighting against the Boers. A practiced reader would foresee this from the start. And, in the eyes of both Bunny and his creator, this cancels his crimes. Both Raffles and Bunny, of course, are devoid of religious belief, and they have no real ethical code, merely certain rules of behavior which they observe semi-instinctively. But it is just here that the deep moral difference between Raffles and No Orchids becomes apparent. Raffles and Bunny, after all, are gentlemen, and such standards as they do have are not to be violated. Certain things are not done, and the idea of doing them hardly arises. Raffles will not, for example, abuse hospitality. He will commit a burglary in a house where he is staying as a guest, but the victim must be a fellow guest and not the host. He will not commit murder, and he avoids violence wherever possible and prefers to carry out his robberies unarmed. He regards friendship as sacred and is chivalrous, though not moral, in his relations with women. He will take extra risks in the name of sportsmanship, and sometimes even for aesthetic reasons. And above all, he is intensely patriotic. He celebrates the Diamond Jubilee. For 60 years, Bunny, We've been ruled over by absolutely the finest sovereign the world has ever seen, by dispatching to the Queen, through the post, an antique gold cup which he has stolen from the British Museum. He steals, from partly political motives, a pearl which the German Emperor is sending to one of the enemies of Britain, and when the Boer War begins to go badly, his one thought is to find his way into the fighting line. At the front, he unmasks a spy at the cost of revealing his own identity, and then dies gloriously by a Boer bullet. In this combination of crime and patriotism, he resembles his near-contemporary Arsène Lupin, who also scores off the German Emperor and wipes out his very dirty past by enlisting in the Foreign Legion. It is important to note that, by modern standards, Raffles' crimes are very petty ones. £400 worth of jewellery seems to him an excellent haul. And, though the stories are convincing in their physical detail, they contain very little sensationalism, very few corpses, hardly any blood, no sex crimes, no sadism, no perversions of any kind. It seems to be the case that the crime story, at any rate on its higher levels, has greatly increased in bloodthirstiness during the past 20 years. Some of the early detective stories do not even contain a murder. The Sherlock Holmes stories, for instance, are not all murders, and some of them do not even deal with an indictable crime. So also with the John Thorndyke stories, while of the Max Carados stories, only a minority are murders. Since 1918, however, a detective story not containing a murder has been a great rarity, and the most disgusting details of dismemberment and exhumation are commonly exploited. Some of the Peter Wimsey stories, for instance, seem to point to definite necrophilia. The Raffles stories, written from the angle of the criminal, are much less antisocial than many modern stories written from the angle of the detective. The main impression that they leave behind is of boyishness. They belong to a time when people had standards, though they happened to be foolish standards. Their key phrase is, "not done." The line that they draw between good and evil is as senseless as a Polynesian taboo, but at least, like the taboo, it has the advantage that everyone accepts it. So much for Raffles. Now for a header into the cesspool. No Orchids for Miss Blandish, by James Hadley Chase, was published in 1939, but seems to have enjoyed its greatest popularity in 1940, during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. In its main outlines, its story is this. Miss Blandish, the daughter of a millionaire, is kidnapped by some gangsters who are, almost immediately, surprised and killed off by a larger and better organized gang. They hold her to ransom and extract $500,000 from her father. Their original plan had been to kill her as soon as the ransom money was received, but a chance keeps her alive. One of the gang is a young man named Slim, whose sole pleasure in life consists in driving knives into other people's bellies. In childhood, he has graduated by cutting up living animals with a pair of rusty scissors. Slim is sexually impotent, but takes a kind of fancy to Miss Blandish. Slim's mother, who is the real brains of the gang, sees in this the chance of curing Slim's impotence, and decides to keep Miss Blandish in custody till Slim shall have succeeded in raping her. After many efforts and much persuasion, including the flogging of Miss Blandish with a length of rubber hosepipe, the rape is achieved. Meanwhile, Miss Blandish's father has hired a private detective, and, by means of bribery and torture, the detective and the police manage to round up and exterminate the whole gang. Slim escapes with Miss Blandish and is killed after a final rape, and the detective prepares to restore Miss Blandish to her family. By this time, however, she has developed such a taste for Slim's caresses that she feels unable to live without him, and she jumps out of the window of a skyscraper. Several other points need noticing before one can grasp the full implications of this book. To begin with, its central story is an impudent plagiarism of William Faulkner's novel Sanctuary. Secondly, it is not, as one might expect, the product of an illiterate hack, but a brilliant piece of writing, with hardly a wasted word or a jarring note anywhere. Thirdly, the whole book, recite as well as dialogue, is written in the American language. The author, an Englishman who has, I believe, never been in the United States, seems to have made a complete mental transference to the American underworld. Fourthly, the book sold, according to its publishers, no less than 500,000 copies. I have already outlined the plot, but the subject matter is much more sordid and brutal than this suggests. The book contains 8 full-dress murders, an unaccessible number of casual killings and woundings, an exhumation, with a careful reminder of the stench, and the flogging of Miss Blandish, the torture of another woman with red-hot cigarette ends, a strip-tease act, a third-degree scene of unheard-of cruelty, and much else of the same kind. It assumes great sexual sophistication in its readers. There is a scene, for instance, in which a gangster, presumably of masochistic tendency, has an orgasm in the moment of being knifed. And it takes for granted the most complete corruption and self-seeking as the norm of human behavior. The detective, for instance, is almost as great a rogue as the gangsters, and actuated by nearly the same motives. Like them, he is in pursuit of 500 grand. It is necessary to the machinery of the story that Mr. Blandish should be anxious to get his daughter back, but apart from this, such things as affection, friendship, good nature, or even ordinary politeness simply do not enter. Nor, to any great extent, does normal sexuality. Ultimately, only one motive is at work throughout the whole story: the pursuit of power. It should be noted that the book is not in the ordinary sense pornography. Unlike most books that deal in sexual sadism, it lays the emphasis on the cruelty and not on the pleasure. Slim, the ravisher of Miss Blandish, has wet, slobbering lips. This is disgusting, and is meant to be disgusting. But the scenes describing cruelty to women are comparatively perfunctory. The real high spots of the book are cruelties committed by men upon other men. Above all, the third-degreeing of the gangster, Eddie Schultz, who is lashed into a chair and flogged on the windpipe with truncheons, his arms broken by fresh blows as he breaks loose. In another of Mr. Chase's books, He Won't Need It Now, the hero, who is intended to be a sympathetic and perhaps even noble character, is described as stamping on somebody's face, and then, having crushed the man's mouth in, grinding his heel round and round in it. Even when physical incidents of this kind are not occurring, the mental atmosphere of these books is always the same. Their whole theme is the struggle for power and the triumph of the strong over the weak. The big gangsters wipe out the little ones as mercilessly as a pike gobbling up the little fish in a pond. The police kill off the criminals as cruelly as the angler kills the pike. If, ultimately, one sides with the police against the gangsters, it is merely because they are better organized and more powerful, because, in fact, the law is a bigger racket than crime. Might is right. Ve victis. As I have mentioned already, No Orchids enjoyed its greatest vogue in 1940, though it was successfully running as a play till some time later. It was, in fact, one of the things that helped to console people for the boredom of being bombed. Early in the war, the New Yorker had a picture of a little man approaching a news stall littered with papers with such headlines as Great Tank Battles in Northern France, Big Naval Battle in the North Sea, Huge Air Battles over the Channel, etc., etc. The little man is saying, "Action stories, please." That little man stood for all the drugged millions to whom the world of the gangsters and the prize ring is more real, more tough than such things as wars, revolutions, earthquakes, famines, and pestilences. From the point of view of a reader of action stories, a description of the London Blitz, or of the struggles of the European underground parties, would be sissy stuff. On the other hand, some puny gun battle in Chicago, resulting in perhaps half a dozen deaths, would seem genuinely tough. This habit of mind is now extremely widespread. A soldier sprawls in a muddy trench, with the machine gun bullets crackling a foot or two overhead, and whiles away his intolerable boredom by reading an American gangster story. And what is it that makes that story so exciting? Precisely the fact that people are shooting at each other with machine guns. Neither the soldier nor anyone else sees anything curious in this. It is taken for granted that an imaginary bullet is more thrilling than a real one. The obvious explanation is that in real life, one is usually a passive victim, whereas in the adventure story, one can think of oneself as being at the center of events. But there is more to it than that. Here it is necessary to refer again to the curious fact of no orchids being written, with technical errors, perhaps, but certainly with considerable skill, in the American language. There exists in America an enormous literature of more or less the same stamp as No Orchids. Quite apart from books, there is a huge array of pulp magazines, graded so as to cater for different kinds of fantasy, but nearly all having much the same mental atmosphere. A few of them go in for straight pornography, but the great majority are quite plainly aimed at sadists and masochists. Sold at 3p a copy under the title of Yank Mags, these things used to enjoy considerable popularity in England, but when the supply dried up owing to the war, no satisfactory substitute was forthcoming. English imitations of the pulp magazine do now exist, but they are poor things compared with the original. English crook films, again, never approach the American crook film in brutality. And yet, the career of Mr. Chase shows how deep the American influence has already gone. Not only is he himself living in a continuous fantasy life in the Chicago underworld, but he can count on hundreds of thousands of readers who know what is meant by a clip shop or the hot squat, do not have to do mental arithmetic when confronted by 50 grand, and understand at sight a sentence like, "Johnny was a rummy and only 2 jumps ahead of the nut factory." Evidently, there are great numbers of English people who are partly Americanized in language and, one ought to add, in moral outlook. For there was no popular protest against No Orchids. In the end, it was withdrawn, but only retrospectively, when a later work, Miss Callahan Comes to Grief, brought Mr. Chase's books to the attention of the authorities. Judging by casual conversations at the time, ordinary readers got a mild thrill out of the obscenities in New Orchids, but saw nothing undesirable in the book as a whole. Many people, incidentally, were under the impression that it was an American book reissued in England. The thing that the ordinary reader ought to have objected to, almost certainly would have objected to, a few decades earlier, was the equivocal attitude towards crime. It is implied throughout No Orchids that being a criminal is only reprehensible in the sense that it does not pay. Being a policeman pays better, but there is no moral difference, since the police use essentially criminal methods. In a book like He Won't Need It Now, the distinction between crime and crime prevention practically disappears. This is a new departure for English sensational fiction, in which, till recently, there has always been a sharp distinction between right and wrong, and a general agreement that virtue must triumph in the last chapter. English books glorifying crime, modern crime, that is, pirates and highwaymen are different, are very rare. Even a book like Raffles, as I have pointed out, is governed by powerful taboos, and it is clearly understood that Raffles's crimes must be expiated sooner or later. In America, both in life and fiction, the tendency to tolerate crime, even to admire the criminal so long as he is successful, is very much more marked. It is, indeed, ultimately this attitude that has made it possible for crime to flourish upon so huge a scale. Books have been written about Al Capone that are hardly different in tone from the books written about Henry Ford, Stalin, Lord Northcliffe, and all the rest of the Log Cabin to White House brigade. And switching back 80 years, one finds Mark Twain adopting much the same attitude towards the disgusting bandit, Slade, hero of 28 murders, and towards the Western desperados generally. They were successful. They made good. Therefore, he admired them. In a book like No Orchids, one is not, as in the old-style crime story, simply escaping from dull reality into an imaginary world of action. One's escape is essentially into cruelty and sexual perversion. No Orchids is aimed at the power instinct which Raffles or the Sherlock Holmes stories are not. At the same time, the English attitude towards crime is not so superior to the American as I may have seemed to imply. It too is mixed up with power worship, and has become more noticeably so in the last 20 years. A writer who is worth examining is Edgar Wallace, especially in such typical books as The Orator or the Mr. J.G. Reader stories. Wallace was one of the first crime story writers to break away from the old tradition of the private detective and make his central figure a Scotland Yard official. Sherlock Holmes is an amateur, solving his problems without the help and even, in the earlier stories, against the opposition of the police. Moreover, like Dupin, he is essentially an intellectual, even a scientist. He reasons logically from observed fact, and his intellectuality is constantly contrasted with the routine methods of the police. Wallace objected strongly to this slur, as he considered it, on Scotland Yard, and in several newspaper articles he went out of his way to denounce Holmes by name. His own ideal was the detective inspector who catches criminals not because he is intellectually brilliant, but because he is part of an all-powerful organization. Hence the curious fact that in Wallace's most characteristic stories, the clue and the deduction play no part. The criminal is always defeated either by an incredible coincidence or because, in some unexplainable manner, the police knew all about the crime beforehand. The tone of the stories makes it quite clear that Wallace's admiration for the police is pure bully worship. A Scotland Yard detective is the most powerful kind of being that he can imagine, while the criminal figures in his mind as an outlaw against whom anything is permissible, like the condemned slaves in the Roman arena. His policemen behave much more brutally than British policemen do in real life. They hit people without provocation, fire revolvers past their ears to terrify them, and so on. And some of the stories exhibit a fearful intellectual sadism. For instance, Wallace likes to arrange things so that the villain is hanged on the same day as the heroine is married, but it is sadism after the English fashion. That is to say, it is unconscious. There is not overtly any sex in it, and it keeps within the bounds of the law. The British public tolerates a harsh criminal law and gets a kick out of monstrously unfair murder trials. But still, that is better, on any count, than tolerating or admiring crime. If one must worship a bully, it is better that he should be a policeman than a gangster. Wallace is still governed to some extent by the concept of not done. In No Orchids, anything is done, so long as it leads on to power. All the barriers are down, all the motives are out in the open. Chase is a worse symptom than Wallace, to the extent that all in wrestling is worse than boxing, or fascism is worse than capitalist democracy. In borrowing from William Faulkner's Sanctuary, Chase took only the plot. The mental atmosphere of the two books is not similar. Chase really derives from other sources, and this particular bit of borrowing is only symbolic. What it symbolizes is the vulgarization of ideas which is constantly happening, and which probably happens faster in an age of print. Chase has been described as Faulkner for the masses, but it would be more accurate to describe him as Carlyle for the masses. He is a popular writer. There are many such in America, but they are still rarities in England, who has caught up with what it is now fashionable to call realism, meaning the doctrine that might is right. The growth of realism has been the great feature of the intellectual history of our own age. Why this should be is a complicated question. The interconnection between sadism, masochism, success worship, power worship, nationalism, and totalitarianism is a huge subject whose edges have barely been scratched, and even to mention it is considered somewhat indelicate. To take merely the first example that comes to mind, I believe no one has ever pointed out the sadistic and masochistic element in Bernard Shaw's work, still less suggested that this probably has some connection with Shaw's admiration for dictators. Fascism is often loosely equated with sadism, but nearly always by people who see nothing wrong in the most slavish worship of Stalin. The truth is, of course, that the countless English intellectuals who kiss the arse of Stalin are not different from the minority who give their allegiance to Hitler or Mussolini, nor from the efficiency experts who preached punch, drive, personality, and learned to be a tiger man in the 1920s, nor from the older generation of intellectuals, Carlyle, Creasy, and the rest of them, who bowed down before German militarism. All of them are worshipping power and successful cruelty. It is important to notice that the cult of power tends to be mixed up with a love of cruelty and wickedness for their own sakes. A tyrant is all the more admired if he happens to be a blood-stained crook as well, and the end justifies the means often becomes, in effect, the means justify themselves provided they are dirty enough. This idea colors the outlook of all sympathizers with totalitarianism and accounts, for instance, for the positive delight with which many English intellectuals greeted the Nazi-Soviet pact. It was a step only doubtfully useful to the USSR, but it was entirely unmoral, and for that reason to be admired. The explanations of it, which were numerous and self-contradictory, could come afterwards. Until recently, the characteristic adventure stories of the English-speaking peoples have been stories in which the hero fights against odds. This is true all the way from Robin Hood to Popeye the Sailor. Perhaps the basic myth of the Western world is Jack the Giant Killer. But, to be brought up to date, this should be renamed Jack the Dwarf Killer, and there already exists a considerable literature which teaches, either overtly or implicitly, that one should side with the big man against the little man. Most of what is now written about foreign policy is simply an embroidery on this theme, and for several decades, such phrases as "play the game," "don't hit a man when he's down," and "it's not cricket" have never failed to draw a snigger from anyone of intellectual pretensions. What is comparatively new is to find the accepted pattern according to which A. Right is right and wrong is wrong, whoever wins, and B. Weakness must be respected, disappearing from popular literature as well. When I first read D.H. Lawrence's novels, at the age of about 20, I was puzzled by the fact that there did not seem to be any classification of the characters into good and bad. Lawrence seemed to sympathize with all of them about equally, and this was so unusual as to give me the feeling of having lost my bearings. Today, no one would think of looking for heroes and villains in a serious novel, but in lowbrow fiction, one still expects to find a sharp distinction between right and wrong, and between legality and illegality. The common people, on the whole, are still living in a world of absolute good and evil from which the intellectuals have long since escaped. But the popularity of No Orchids and the American books and magazines to which it is akin show how rapidly the doctrine of realism is gaining ground. Several people, after reading No Orchids, have remarked to me, "It's pure fascism." This is a correct description, although the book has not the smallest connection with politics and very little with social or economic problems. It has merely the same relation to fascism as, say, Trollope's novels have to 19th century capitalism. It is a daydream appropriate to a totalitarian age. In his imagined world of gangsters, Chase is presenting, as it were, a distilled version of the modern political scene, in which such things as mass bombing of civilians, the use of hostages, torture to obtain confessions, secret prisons, execution without trial, floggings with rubber truncheons, drownings in cesspools, systematic falsification of records and statistics, treachery, bribery, and Quislingism are normal and morally neutral, even admirable when they are done in a large and bold way. The average man is not directly interested in politics, and when he reads, he wants the current struggles of the world to be translated into a simple story about individuals. He can take an interest in Slim and Fenner as he could not in the GPU and the Gestapo. People worship power in the form in which they are able to understand it. A 12-year-old boy worships Jack Dempsey. An adolescent in a Glasgow slum worships Al Capone. An aspiring pupil at a business college worships Lord Nuffield. A New Statesman reader worships Stalin. There is a difference in intellectual maturity, but none in moral outlook. 30 years ago, the heroes of popular fiction had nothing in common with Mr. Chase's gangsters and detectives, and the idols of the English liberal intelligentsia were also comparatively sympathetic figures. Between Holmes and Fenner on the one hand, and between Abraham Lincoln and Stalin on the other, there is a similar gulf. One ought not to infer too much from the success of Mr. Chase's books. It is possible that it is an isolated phenomenon, brought about by the mingled boredom and brutality of war. But if such books should definitely acclimatize themselves in England, instead of being merely a half-understood import from America, there would be good grounds for dismay. In choosing Raffles as a background for No Orchids, I deliberately chose a book which, by the standards of its time, was morally equivocal. Raffles, as I have pointed out, has no real moral code, no religion, certainly no social consciousness. All he has is a set of reflexes, the nervous system, as it were, of a gentleman. Give him a sharp tap on this reflex or that. They are called sport, pal, woman, king and country, and so forth, and you get a predictable reaction. In Mr. Chase's book, there are no gentlemen and no taboos. Emancipation is complete. Freud and Machiavelli have reached the outer suburbs. Comparing the schoolboy atmosphere of the one book with the cruelty and corruption of the other, one is driven to feel that snobbishness, like hypocrisy, is a check upon behavior whose value from a social point of view has been underrated.